Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you might be tuning in to this latest broadcast of View from the Right. I'm Paul Kersey. As always, I'm joined by Gregory Hood for View from the Right. Mr. Hood, how are you Labor Day weekend?
Well, obviously, we're thinking about what happened with Hurricane Katrina. And in many ways, I feel like that event sort of introduced the modern political era that we're in. It predates Black Lives Matter, but a lot of the things that we live through now, especially the way the media operates, conspiracy culture, the almost diametrically opposed realities that whites and blacks live in, and certainly liberal and conservative media, the inability to come up with a common narrative, even regarding something that the whole country is affected by, all of that just comes straight from Katrina.
Yeah, and we're recording this 20 years now to the date of what happened in the Gulf of America. It was the Gulf of Mexico then
That's right.
when
But now it's the
Hurricane,
Gulf of America.
when Hurricane Katrina touched down, and it did a direct hit on New Orleans, Biloxi, Mississippi. And then for the next few days, well, actually, for a long time after, but for the next few days, the entire world was riveted by what we saw develop in the aftermath of the flood. In fact, I've been told that Netflix just put out Spike Lee's documentary on Hurricane Katrina, and this event, which happened in 2005, Mr. Hood, it predates social media by a few years. Facebook had just started in 2003, early 2004, but at that point it was called the Facebook, and I don't believe you could do any video uploads. YouTube had yet to be bought by Google. Twitter was not around. You didn't have the ubiquity of cell phone cameras, so internet was out. But I guess my question to you would be, what are your early recollections? Because I guess you were still at William and Mary, getting ready to graduate, or you had graduated.
I think it was still there. But what was interesting about Katrina, I think, was I remember following the coverage at the time, and it was the first incident that I can recall where different conservative and liberal media, it wasn't that they were getting different opinions, it's that you were getting different facts. And one of the interesting ones, of course, was the one where they had a black guy carrying away something, and they were like, black guy looting, and then they had white guy carrying food, and the liberals made great hay of the way this was reported. But then I remember a conservative outlet did some more reporting, and it turned out the white guy actually was getting food. Like they actually did the research into the incident behind it and said, yeah, this is actually how it was playing out. And you saw this with a lot of different things, with what was happening in the Superdome, with the attacks on the white tourists, especially from Britain, with the way that you had looting in outlying communities. And we knew people in the military and stuff. And so you'd hear these rumors. There were a lot of anecdotes that I'm sure we'll get into in a bit here. But it is the first incident that I can think of, even more than 9/11. Where 9/11, I mean, there were lots of rumors that day, but more or less, regardless of who you were reading, you were basically getting the same story about what it is that had happened, aside from like 9/11 truthers or something like that. But you weren't getting something different on Fox News that you were getting from the New York Times. And this was something where you were just getting diametrically different versions of reality. And fundamentally, I think the root of Trumpism is Katrina. I don't think that if Katrina hadn't worked out the way it did, you would not have seen Donald Trump come to prominence. You would not have seen Donald Trump come to the idea of the fake news media.
That's such an astonishing point, because I've long wondered all those little milestones that had to happen to create Donald Trump. And going back to '05, obviously we were in the midst of the absolute failure of the occupation of Iraq, which of course has been retconned. I don't think you and I saw American Sniper together when that came out, but it's fascinating to think that Chris Kyle, who was played by Bradley Cooper in the film, that was one of those moments where that entire episode in American history was whitewashed in an interesting way, where we have to go over there to fight them so they don't come over here and fight us, I think was one of the main lines motivating his actions. And what's fascinating about that is he's claimed, Mr. Hood, Chris Kyle has claimed that he was actually deployed to New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina. And this was actually in a Washington Post article where they tried to fact check a lot of his claims. Because remember, he claimed he knocked out Jesse the Body Ventura. Uh,
Yeah.
not 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 in the Baja, California, but they got in a fight or something because he was a former Navy SEAL, a fraudman himself. But Chris Kyle claimed that he was deployed to New Orleans to restore order, and that from atop the Superdome, he killed 30 plus people. And again, this is one of those things. It's like I'm not sure where this came from. It's one of those
But
stories.
it's not something that just comes from one thing. I mean, Cynthia McKinney, who was the black congresswoman out of Georgia, one of the
Correct.
earliest, I guess you could say, proto squad members. She was anti-Israel before that was really allowed in the Democratic Party.
Very
And
much
so she
so.
was basically primaried and driven out. But I think it was after she got out, she started speaking at all these sort of black nationalist type conferences and making these claims that there are these mass graves all around New Orleans and people were shooting everyone. And of course, there's no evidence of this. Nobody has found any of these things. But then again, I mean, this is just an anecdotal story, but I was talking to a guy who was special forces in Afghanistan and then did Blackwater when he got back. And so, of course, he knows all these different people. And he was saying, oh, yeah, like people were saying all the time, all these guys in the industry were saying that they were going down to Katrina and it was just like a shooting gallery, particularly because a lot of these foreign companies that had assets in the area were basically hiring them. And they were just going nuts the whole time, blazing away at people. Now, people talk, right? I mean, it's not the same thing as evidence. At the same time, we remember the unbelievable chaos that was happening while this was unfolding. I mean, it was total anarchy. I mean, you had the complete collapse of American government in a major American city within the span of like 2 hours.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
if you did have all these things happening, how exactly would you know? I mean, it wasn't where everybody had a cell phone in their pocket with the camera and everything else. I mean, if any of this stuff did happen, how would you even go about proving it?
And most importantly, New Orleans is a vastly important port city and unbelievable assets, total loss, private contractors coming in to protect property. As we know, just looking at post-apartheid South Africa, the largest employer now or the largest sector is the security service. And all of these assets were just completely abandoned by the local government under the watch of Ray Nagin. Wasn't am I wrong in saying that Bobby Jindal, the
I think
Indian,
he was
was the
governor at the
governor?
time.
Wasn't he the governor of? Yeah, goodness gracious. That or Landrew. I'll look it up as we're talking because again, Bobby Jindal was basically Vivek 1.0.
Right.
There's a name I haven't thought of in a while. I've started to see him all over X. He's hawking some form of healthcare product and he's inundating X. It's just like,
you might as well get Vivek Ramaswamy's Alzheimer's drug if you're going to go in for that.
Exactly. But it's such a fascinating look in American history because President Bush had just won his second term. And this was the moment that brought about the worst incident in his presidency. 9/11 takes a back seat to Kanye West saying George Bush doesn't care about black people.
Yeah, how funny is it considering where Kanye is now that he was he was like the liberal conscience back then.
Yeah, people, if you've never seen this, so I wish we could intersperse some of the quotes when Michael Myers, they're doing this telethon for the victims of Katrina. And all of a sudden, Michael Myers stops talking and Kanye West just blurts out, George Bush doesn't care about black people. And then Michael Myers gives him this just utterly terrified look because it was off script. And yet this came to define the Bush presidency. In a lot of ways, the reaction to how the national Republicans dealt with this, people still talk about that incorrectly because it was as if the consequences of a complete black controlled local government and black appointed bureaucracy had nothing to do with what was transpiring in New Orleans, of what would take place at the Superdome, what would take place at the convention center, what would take place in all the various wards and all the various stories that we've all heard from the bridges that a lot of the black individuals tried to cross that were into majority white parishes. I think Mother Jones and the Nation spent a number of years researching this fact to see if it was in fact a race war. When in reality, what happened is in a span of hours, as Jared Taylor wrote about in his immortal essay, Africa in Our Midst, Western civilization, the civilization that whites created, it completely disappeared in a span of a few hours. And for those of us in this sphere of ideological concern, this was that moment that every lie of race being a social construct evaporated, and we saw in stark reality that equality is the social construct, and that believing that we could even have a civilization and have any standards of civility, those disappeared in the just grotesque um, aftermath of the Superdome, where those who stayed behind, they all went to seek shelter. And it became the genesis of stories that to this day, a lot of people don't want to believe.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole narrative that it was, I believe, a black National Guard commander who actually led the relief of the city. I remember Christopher Hitchens even trying to make this into a he was doing the liberal pro America spin at the
General
time.
Henri was his name.
That's right.
He was a mulatto.
Right.
He was a cigar chomping mulatto. So
Right. And they were trying to make this into a whole big thing and everything else. And I remember how hollow that sounded because we had seen even the police force joining in the looting
yeah.
in the immediate aftermath.
Oh yeah.
And it really felt like some of those stories you'd hear about the last days of colonialism or the Sepoy Rebellion or something like that, where you had these white people besieged in the Superdome, being threatened with rape, being threatened with all these kinds of things. And you have this like vanishingly small group of white men trying to protect them. And somehow it didn't lead to a slaughter, but it very well could have. I think it ripped the mask off American racial reality in a way that it hasn't been put on since, even more than the O.J. Simpson trial.
Wow. And we saw in the immediate aftermath, there was an attempt to downplay the New Orleans Time-Picayune. They were lauded with Pulitzer Prizes. I'm not even sure if they still publish anymore. I just read the other day that the Atlanta Journal-Constitution is no longer going to be publishing a print edition. But at the time, a lot of the reports that were coming out, there had to be a counter narrative to that. And the New Orleans Time-Picayune, they published a story called Rape, Murder, Gunfights at the end of September, where they basically tried to say, yeah, there's no way we can corroborate any of this. I remember reading InfoWars a lot at that time period. I was basically doing a steady diet of InfoWars, and I was reading VDare because Steve Saylor at the time was putting out some of the best writing on the reaction and what was happening, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Because in a lot of ways, that's where Steve became persona non grata because of what he wrote.
Right.
John Podhoretz said, what did he say? Let me make sure I get it right. I think he said it was the most contemptible line ever uttered. Let's see here. Hold on. I'll read it for you. He said that it may not be the denunciation of Bush after all. I think West is given a run for his money by Steve Saylor's shockingly racist and paternalistic riff off the New Orleans slogan, let the good times roll, on the website vdare.com. Quote, this is what Saylor wrote. What you won't hear except from me is that let the good times roll is an especially risky message for African Americans. The plain fact is that they tend to possess poorer native judgment than members of better educated groups. Thus, they need stricter moral guidance from society. End quote. Podhoretz would basically go to war with VDare. And in a lot of ways, that was the beginning of that massive rift where Peter was no longer invited or even tolerated at places like CPAC, Peter Brimlow, or Steve Saylor in a lot of ways, because Steve noticed what was happening. And, you know, Mr. Hood, I think, as you said, this was a time where a lot of people started noticing. And they've never been told that, you know, it's okay to notice, but more importantly, it's okay to implement policies that ensure something like this never happens again. And just a quick anecdote. Gosh, I was just thinking about what happened last year with FEMA in North Carolina, where a lot of the heavily white areas in North Carolina were completely abandoned and left on their own. But um, there was no rioting, there was no mass chaos. And then we learned in the lead up to the election that when FEMA went to Florida, they were told, a black FEMA employee was actually told, don't go to homes that have a Trump placard in the front yard. Avoid those homes. Do you remember this?
Yeah.
I mean,
Oh
this
yeah.
you forget. I mean, I think the guy's name, I don't think it was Scott Brown. I forget the guy's name who was in charge of FEMA at the time, but he took a lot of the flack. But again, it comes down to who was in charge of New Orleans. Are they do they have no moral agency? Are they not capable of actually performing the duties of the executive branch, which they held? Like Ray Nagin, if you remember, Ray Nagin was the mulatto mayor of New Orleans at the time, and he famously said, New Orleans is going to stay a chocolate city. He was coming under unreal attack. In fact, what we didn't know was just the complete breakdown of the chain of command in New Orleans, in terms of the police chief at the time was this just utter incompetent black guy named Compass, who made a lot of shocking claims of what was happening. He claimed that Mr. Hood, was nearly taken hostage at the convention center. And in fact, I was just reading through some anecdotes in a book called Eye of the Storm Inside City Hall During Katrina by Sally Foreman. And they talked about this at length because you had so much information coming in. City Hall had broken down. I believe that they were at a Hyatt. That's where City Hall had to go to because there was just no power anywhere. And you had all this disparate information coming in. You have no idea what's going on. In fact, one of the earliest stories I remember encountering was this claim that they found a couple score bodies in some sort of freezer. Do you remember this?
Yeah. I 100% remember it. I
And
remember. And yeah, good gone.
yeah, but a number of people were verifying this. And then all of a sudden, when the AP, when the New Orleans Time-Picayune, when they decided to fact check all these claims of what was happening out in the convention center, what was happening at the Superdome, they're like, yeah, this just kind of spread. We never saw any bodies. There's nothing that happened. But again, it goes back to what you said. There's a span of about 2 days where the city is utterly lawless, where the majority of the police and the majority of the police at that point were black. At that point, New Orleans had about 425,000 people. The city was about 65% black, police force heavily black. They just abandoned their jobs. They just walked off of their duties. So any of these apocalyptic films you see of individuals who care about their job, their duty, that was all washed away by what happened early in Katrina. And so you then have the stories of helicopters being shot at by snipers, which makes the role of these individuals almost impossible. You're trying to see the evacuation of hospitals because of the elderly patients, those individuals who needed life support, who needed the power to stay on so they could stay alive, and they couldn't evacuate them just because you had just an utter breakdown of every layer of civilization that, again, we all take for granted. When you drive your car out and you pass by a firehouse, you pass by police stations, you're just like, oh, this is great. This is just a normal day. That all went away. And then, as Steve Saylor wrote, you then have a population that is nearly 3/4 black. And the people who stayed behind were probably 9 out of 10 black people. 90% of the population of the city was probably black at that point. It just all went away and it all vanished. And then what we saw was really, as Jared Taylor said it best, Africa in our midst.
Yeah, one of the biggest things that we remember from the time were these school buses,
Mm-hmm.
and because they said, "Oh, there was no evacuation," and of course, this became the fault of everybody else. This became the fault of the white people because the blacks couldn't be bothered to evacuate themselves. Well, there were all these school buses that ended up getting flooded. And there was this great image that you can find from the time where you have all these school buses basically completely underwater, and this became one of the right-wing only images from Katrina. You never saw this among the liberal media. You never saw this cited by liberal reporters. But this is what conservatives were passing around to say, no, this is on the liberal government of New Orleans. And by liberal government, of course, what we really mean, and this is something that's very relevant when we think about President Trump's war on crime, the black government of New Orleans.
Yeah, going back to this book that I quoted from, Sally Foreman is the author. She was the city's communication director when the hurricane struck. And she has this just really incredible passage where she's talking about how Secretary Chertoff, there's a name I haven't thought of in a while. I think he was the first DHS head. Gosh, what a tangled web we weave when we go from Chertoff to Nome. But anyways, he issued a press release, and it said, this was in the day 2 of Katrina. He said, quote, "We're extremely pleased with the response that every element of the federal government, all our federal partners, have made to this terrible tragedy," end quote. Foreman wrote, quote, "Had I read it, I would have become ill. Here we were sitting in a war zone. Disease, death, and violence surrounded us. The governor was telling us that soldiers and buses were coming, but we saw none of it. The president had said the cavalry was coming, but we didn't see them. Hell, we hadn't even seen any of their scouts," end quote. Now, again, they are at the Hyatt at that point. That's where the city government sought refuge to try and maintain a working government in this crisis. You basically have the black police chief, Eddie Compass, whose police force has, as you stated, they're on film. You can watch. I was trying to find the video. I think it was 2020 or Good Morning America. A white journalist is interviewing all these people as they're looting a Walmart, and a black female officer, is participating in the looting. And one of the best quotes I remember, I won't say who told this to me, but they said, "Hey, remember this? Remember during Katrina, the best quote was that everything is gone from the Walmart except for the Shania Twain CDs." And that's always struck me as one of the funniest lines, because it's like, well, I guess that kind of tells you who your average looter was if Shania Twain CDs were left behind. But isn't that sort of an interesting look at life in 2005 before iTunes came? But that is one of the, along with 9/11, you think about how a tragedy would be documented now, where everybody has their flip phones out. Has their iPhones out to document whether you're at a sporting event, a concert. Every angle of an event is tracked. It's kind of like, if you remember during the 2017 Las Vegas shooting, there were a lot of initial videos that showed every aspect of the shooting, of whatever transpired that night. Imagine if we had actually gotten that from Katrina. Imagine if we, instead of this book, which I think is, if you want to take a look at a really important book to read by a white liberal who is just apologetic about the privilege he has, it's this guy named Paul Harris, who wrote Diary from the Dome, Reflections on Fear and Privilege During Katrina. And Mr. Hood, he was one of the individuals who was in New Orleans when it happened, who sought refuge at the Superdome. And he ended up befriending and sticking with the Australians and the British, who were sort of the source for the international furor that erupted over what actually happened in the Superdome. Because if you recall, it was the foreign press that was telling us about the hell on earth that was happening within the Superdome. As there were roving gangs, you had no authority because the police had just abandoned their jobs and gone home to their families, while simultaneously there's no water. The water's not working. The sewage isn't working. The restrooms aren't working then. There's no food. And you heard stories that there were women being raped incessantly throughout the Superdome, that they were having to form packs around the white Europeans to protect them from this violence. And this guy, Paul Harris, documents it all. But the entire book is just dripping with disdain for the privilege that he had to be able to be part of this group of European and Australian tourists, white people, who he believed got preferential treatment from a member of the National Guard. I believe his name was Ogden. I'll confirm that here in 1 second. But to me, this is one of those moments in time where I wish we knew everything that actually happened at the Superdome. Because if you remember, the next year it opened in 2006, and the Saints played a pretty big football game. And it's like, how could you ever have anything at that venue again after what we heard happened? After all these stories of what it took to regain control. And the same thing with the convention center. And when you search for a lot of these stories, it takes you to dead end pages that are no longer available. And that's one of the really devastating impacts of censorship on the internet, because the Netflix documentary, Mr. Hood, it basically tries to say, Spike Lee, he tries to get across the point that the levees were intentionally blown up. And the whole
Yeah, this is something they all believe. I
I,
mean, this is one of the big things where it was the first time that I think we really saw the extent of what ordinary blacks actually believe in this country.
Mhm, mhm.
And you cannot reason with it. I mean, we're just in a diametrically opposed reality, and it's impervious to facts, because I have no doubt that these people, Brown, Bush, doing a heck of a job, Brownie, all this kind of thing, they thought they were doing the best they could. And they were genuinely hurt when they were accused of all these things. But of course, the counterpoint is this is the only thing it can lead to. It doesn't matter what you do. This is all you're going to get. And even if you sacrifice everything to try to help them, they're just going to accuse you of deliberately killing them.
No, and that's there's a great book called I think I heard it through the grapevine, which is about, Jared did a great review, or someone did a great review on it from American Renaissance decades ago, and it's about how rumor and innuendo spread within the black community. I think one of the main things was that Church's Chicken was owned by the KKK, and that if you ate too much of the chicken, it would cause sterility. It's like, oh, okay. But this is the conspiracy theory of all conspiracy theories for a lot of the black community, because they thought that there was this plan to try and drive out the black population so whites could regain control. Because as you documented in a piece at AR, New Orleans, prior to the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, was 65% white. It had always been a white city. Yes, you had a mulatto population. Yes, you had a Cajun population. Yes, there was a black underclass. But it was not untenable to live in New Orleans when you had segregation. When that went away, when Shelley Kramer happened, so you can no longer have restrictive covenants, you couldn't control who lived in neighborhoods. And thus you had the outlying parishes become populated and become highly segregated. So this idea of the levees being blown up was, I believe the main crux of it is that the U.S. Corps of Engineer, the Army engineers, blew it up on purpose so that it would drive out the lower Ninth Ward, which is Anacostia on steroids. For those who know about Anacostia in DC,
Oh, yeah.
The lower Ninth Ward is hell on earth. It's hell on earth. And it's an area, New Orleans, for the longest time, it was considered the most dangerous city in America. I believe that that honor is either Jackson, Mississippi, or St. Louis now. But New Orleans was always a place where it's like, hey, if you're going down there for, to go have some fun at the French Quarter or Bourbon Street, you do not venture far off of those streets. You do not want to end up in, inadvertently in the Ninth Ward. It's a place that even the people who live there, they don't want to be there. And so the idea was that you flood that area out, and the government basically declares a lot of the public housing no longer a place where people can have their homes. They'll be displaced. As we know, a lot of those people went to Houston, to Baton Rouge, to Shreveport, and some actually went to Tennessee. But the idea is that this was going to drive gentrification of New Orleans. And correct me if I'm wrong, but New Orleans is actually nearly as black as it was then. The population has dropped considerably by about 80,000 people, but the black population is about 65%. And you've got, again, a black dominated government. So even if the idea of the levees being blown up were true, which it's not, They had actually they had allocated funds to fix all of these problems that they knew existed in a city that's below sea level. And again, infrastructure has to be fixed, or else it's going to break down over time, as we have seen in Jackson, Mississippi.
Well, this is one of these things where the problem of maintaining infrastructure, even basic infrastructure, even water treatment in black run cities, notably Jackson, Mississippi, Flint, Michigan, this is just something that cannot be done. And we're seeing this now with public safety. I mean, again, Katrina really paved the way for the debates we're having now. One of the most basic duties of government is to maintain public safety. Katrina, we saw it fail in the most spectacular manner possible. As Jared Taylor put it, when blacks are in charge, civilization, any kind of Western civilization, any civilization fails overnight. And we don't really have an answer within the current political system as to what we're supposed to do about that. The closest we've come is what President Trump is doing now, where we basically just federalize it and have these people take over.
You know, that essay by Jared Taylor, my grandmother, very distinguished woman, she passed away at the end of 2018. My grandparents were both very, very distinguished people. And that's actually how I started to read about a lot of this stuff, because for some reason, my grandparents were really interested in the immigration issue, and they would get these monthly newspapers called Middle American News. And I just remember one day being like, hey, what's this? I was there one summer for a basketball camp, and I started reading it. And I was incredibly young. I might have been 10, but there was like an essay on crime, and it just, things clicked, because I grew up in the suburbs of one of America's most important metropolitan areas, big cities. And just the things that I encountered whenever we went to that city and what I was told by my parents, it didn't make any sense to me. And then reading some of these essays, it was like, wow, I live in this little slice of America that is vanishing. This is crazy. I don't get this. Why are we allowing this to happen? And that's how I sort of found out about Jared Taylor and American Renaissance. So I subscribed to his newsletter, and I'll never forget, she read the essay Africa in Our Midst, and she goes, this is the most important thing I've ever read in my life. Never has an essay just so clearly stated the problem and how we have to accept that problem is not going to get better. It's only going to get worse. This essay is brilliant. She went and she made a bunch of copies, and she would hand it out to people, to her friends. And, you can imagine, in people of that age who had grown up at the end of segregation before civil rights, the Civil Rights Act, who still remembered what our major cities were like, to then have to entertain and see in your face that everything that had been done to all these constructs, they were all built on faulty logic. And it all just came crashing down during Katrina. And at the same time, you juxtapose that. I told you that I was reading InfoWars. At that point, Alex was still 100% behind, any conspiracy that you can think of. Oh, it's HARP.
Yeah, right.
It's HARP. It's weather modification, and the globalists are trying to depopulate. It's like, well, I'm not so sure I don't disagree with the globalists on some of the things, but Alex, I don't think this is exactly the winning message here. That's going to excite a lot of people when you've got these images of, as you said, all these buses that were just left to sit and parked, hundreds of buses that were then flooded. These images are amazing because, a lot of the conservatives were like, well, this is a failure of government. It's a failure of people to think and to utilize these to transport them, far away from a city that is, was built beneath the floodplain, that is built at the end of the Mississippi River, where these areas can flood. There was no competency within the government. And then again, there's a pocket of people at the time who had the courage to connect the dots and just say, yeah, this is race, guys. This is a pretty black-white issue. And the people who are in charge of New Orleans, it's a heavily black city. It's a black elected government. You've got a black elected police chief. You've got a majority black police force. And it all broke down in a span of 2 to 3 hours. And you then, of course, had, Ray Nagin going on TV every day, begging for help. And as you said, I mean, a lot of the initial stories talked about the violence that was going on. And the guy's name, by the way, the book that I told you about, which you have to read, this is an assignment because it's really important to understand how white liberals will create a narrative around an event. And like I said, this guy, Paul Harris, he wrote a book called Diary from the Dome, Reflections on Fear and Privilege During Katrina. And he was in the Superdome with all these European tourists, Australian tourists. And he talks about how there was one guy who had been communicating, this white guy from Australia, who had been communicating on and off with Staff Sergeant Garland Ogden, to try and get the international group out. We were simply known amongst ourselves as Section 113. This was the section of the monstrous cavern known as the Superdome where we were living. And again, the only thing that this guy can do is try and be like, yeah, there was violence happening. Yeah, it was pretty terrifying. But at the same time, was it our white privilege that got us out? Was it the fact that we were white and these people were looking out?
Nobody, you saw, there was not the full wokeness that you see now, where regardless of what happens, white people are going to blame themselves, blame their privilege. White privilege wasn't even really a mainstream concept then. It certainly wasn't academia, but it wasn't the kind of thing that normal people really talked about. But again, you saw the beginnings of that there, where it was, I'm reminded of Larry Oster's first law of minority-majority relations, where the worse that a minority community behaves, the more you have to justify them as a moral good. The more you have to say that actually they're the exemplar. The more you have to not make excuses. That's the wrong way to look at it. Make positive arguments about how they are better than white people. And we saw that with Katrina, where you had unbelievable incompetence. I mean, just like the opposite of honorable conduct. If this happened in a white neighborhood, you would have stories of white men, protecting their families and making sure that everybody gets food and medical care and setting up a rationing system and making sure that the sick and the old are moved to a place of safety as quickly as possible. In New Orleans, you had stories of the black police raiding the pharmacies to steal stuff and then abandoning their duty or helping to rob. And you had stories in the Superdome of the blacks just threatening to rape white girls and completely collapsing. The only thing they could think of to loot is liquor and all the rest of it. And it was because they acted like that, and because everybody saw them act like that, and because that is who they are, and that is who they have always been, and that is who they will always be. That is why we had to say they were the victims. That is why we had to say that they were martyred by the evil Bush administration. And you know what? Politically, that worked. I mean, Katrina was the beginning of the end for the Bush administration. It led to the shellacking, as Bush himself put it, in 2006.
In a lot of ways, it was the beginning of the end of the Bush dynasty. If you remember, George H.W. Bush's wife, she made some very over-the-top comments about the accommodations in the Houston Astrodome, where she was talking about how, these people have better dwellings than where they came from. I think she said something to that effect, Barbara Bush, when she did a tour of the Houston Astrodome, where they set up the Astrodome at that point was no longer having any big events. It was this just massive, beautiful, unbelievable building that was deemed antiquated because it didn't have enough luxury boxes. But like you said, so much of what was initially published, so much of what was initially told about just the utter breakdown, why police abandoned their jobs. Again, we don't know what happened because for a couple days, there was no federal government. There was no federal response to it because it happened so quickly. I mean, that's the one thing you go back. I mean, this storm, it did, and this was one of the reasons why, and I don't want to spend too much time talking about Alex Jones, but he kept talking over and over and over again about HARP and this weather modification technology. The globalists are trying to flood us. Because the hurricane did change trajectory. But at the same time, what happened in areas of heavily hit Mississippi that were heavily white, you didn't see the utter breakdown. The devastation was actually, in some cases, far worse in Mississippi. But people helped one another out. People prepared for the storm. People didn't take that as an opportunity to loot and to riot. And you were talking about how a lot of these stories seeped into pop culture. For some reason, I happened to be watching It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia last night, and the episode was about this storm that was about to hit Philadelphia. And throughout the entire episode, they make jokes about, and this came out in 2012, they're making jokes about Hurricane Katrina and the difference between how blacks and white people react to a national to a calamity, to a natural disaster. And they're talking about how, oh, white people are just trying to get food, whereas all these blacks are trying to get TVs and stereos and all this stuff. And they're like, yeah, if you're getting food, you're trying to ensure that you have some basic necessities that are all of a sudden gone, potable water. But as we saw with Katrina, you just saw people just carrying anything they could in their shopping carts. And just going back to the Superdome real quick, I think this is an important passage to read from Diary from the Dome by this white liberal Paul Harris. He wrote, I would estimate there were a couple other 1,000 white people in the dome who were not part of our select Section 113. If whites were in danger of attack by blacks, why were we the chosen people? We were definitely not the only tourists in the Superdome. Most likely it was a combination of Bud's efforts. Bud was the Australian who was talking to Staff Sergeant Ogden, but various motivations and racism that got us this privileged spot. We were about 85% white, and the Superdome community at large was about 85% black. Regardless of the variables, the final reality shadowed the cruel reality that exists in America and most every country. That being that there are special privileged classes of people that are given life-enhancing favors not based on earning it, but based on who they happen to be or who they know or what they inherited. This favoritism comes through via networking amongst the well-placed. It shows itself through favoritism toward the rich and famous, those fortunate to be born into wealth and or majority skin color. Again, all we know of the Superdome is from a couple of stories that have been established. And this book, I don't remember what year it was published. I'm probably one of the few people who actually read it, actually. But the point is, it's something really sinister did happen in the Superdome to cause all these stories to perpetuate, to cause that fear, and to create that urgency in Staff Sergeant Ogden, who is a hero in my book. He's one of the great unsung heroes, and there would be an amazing movie made about what happened, to cause these people to realize, hey, these guys are in trouble. We've got to get them out of here. And when you piece together the anecdotes from Ray Nagin's book, that there was about to be a coup attempt of people who were demanding rescue, who had no food, no water at the convention center, which was heavily black. That was the area, Mr. Hood, where those stories of all these bodies found in the refrigeration units, that's where those originated from. And Jared Taylor has always said that his big mistake writing Africa in Our Midst was he didn't cite everything because he can no longer find the initial reports. And as he talks about in Africa in Our Midst, a lot of the National Guardsmen who were then deployed 3 or 4 or 5 days after the Katrina made landfall, they talked about how this was more violent and it was more horrifying and horrific than what they encountered in Iraq. And you're asking yourself, well, what did you guys encounter? Like, again, the corporate media immediately in September went into trying to dispel all of these stories that they could. And then what we saw from, Your Mother Jones, from The Nation, all these other left-leaning publications, Atlantic, it was all about basically trying to say, well, the real evil people were those white individuals who lived in the outlying parishes, who patrolled their neighborhoods, who patrolled their communities, who wouldn't allow these downtrodden refugees, these blacks, into their communities because they were fearful of rioting, looting, raping, murders, etc. But that's because that's all you were hearing was happening in New Orleans, because that's what, Ray Nagin, the police chief Compass, that's all they kept talking about was how violent things were. Can Bush and FEMA and the National Guard get here to rescue us?
Yeah. I mean, the fact that there was no follow-up on these extraordinary allegations, which were all well known at the time, and people were talking about at the time, and in many ways the internet was more uncontrolled at the time, so you would hear these sorts of stories, and yet the media never followed up. The only media follow-up that we got was just reinforcement of the victimization narrative, which was successfully purveyed. because you just didn't have the same kind of counter media that you had now. But you did have the beginnings of that counter media, which is why we are where we are today, in part because Katrina began the process.
Yeah, going back to the whole New Orleans Times-Picayune, they were lauded again. Oh, your concept, all journalists are bastards. Again, it was their duty to mop up and to provide PR for the just absolutely pillared black leadership of New Orleans. And of course, I want to say that Mayor Nagin, he might still be in jail for various kickbacks and things, because at the time there were people saying, "Oh, this guy's doing such a great job of playing the victim status. He might represent the future of the Democrat Party." And of course, that went away really fast. And then Henri, of course, became just a hero. General Henri. He was the gentleman you alluded to earlier. He was the light-skinned mulatto army general who came in, and he was put in charge. In fact, he wrote a book. I've got it somewhere, where they just came in and they said, we're in charge now. We're going to treat these people not as enemy combatants, because that was one of the things that he was so disgusted by, is that in a lot of the initial videos and photos you see, all of the National Guardsmen are carrying automatic weapons. And he said, let's put these away. These are Americans we're here to help out with. And we're here to...
Well, that was also where you had some of the first reports of firing on rescue workers, which is now something we've come to expect. But back then, it was considered a big deal. And one of the interesting things about Katrina, too, and this is something that has lived on in right-wing history, although it's a little different than what we've talked about so far, because it's not directly correlated with race, although I don't think it would have happened were it not for the racial issue, is the gun confiscations that happened afterward. Yeah. The NRA made a lot of hay about this, because this is one of the few times in American history where you can point to a government doing this and saying, yes, this is what we're going to do. And of course, the reason that they did it, again, why do blacks have to be portrayed as the victims? Because they are incompetent and violent in these situations and destroyed themselves. Therefore, we have to praise them as being better than us. If you ask, why are there gun confiscations? Because the government spectacularly failed to maintain basic order in an event that everybody knew was coming for a very long time. And the police forces and the official forces crumbled overnight. And because that happened, we have to make sure that citizens can't defend themselves. Because we failed, we have to make sure that you are not allowed to succeed. Because we can't do our job, we have to make sure that you aren't able to do it by yourself. Because if you do that, then what are we even here for? I mean, one of the funniest things that I saw in terms of this doublethink was, do you remember, I think his name's Randall Robinson. He was one of these reparations activists. Used to live in America, I think.
Yeah. He wrote a book about reparations.
And I remember like 2 days after Katrina, he was like writing these overwrought essays like, oh, I am speechless and horrified and disgust with America because people in New Orleans are resorting to cannibalism. And it's like, nobody is resorting to cannibalism after 2 days in a city where there's food everywhere. And if they were, what does that say about your people?
No, it is interesting, because the two great books that have been written so far in New Orleans, there have been a number of books about Katrina. I would actually argue reading Diary from the Dome by Paul Harris is really important to get that look from a white liberal who almost is apologizing for the fact that he survived when so many other people did not survive. And he believes it was his white privilege that did. But then what you just mentioned, The Great New Orleans Gun Grab, Descent into Anarchy by Gordon Hutchinson and Ton Basin. It's a vastly important book because it talks about how you had gun confiscation going on as federal officers went door to door for those who remained within New Orleans, because they had reconnaissance on the ground that they felt justified in going to make sure that, hey, we're not going to get shot at anymore. And it was an extreme issue that at the time, one of the few publications that really talked about this a lot was InfoWars' Alex Jones and Reason Magazine, believe it or not. This was before Reason went all in on open borders, and they were talking about the gun issue. But I want to go back and just read real quick, because I finally got the article up. This was a Pulitzer Prize winning article that had the title Rape, Murder, Gunfights. At the Superdome, it never happened. This was originally published on September 26, 2005. by the New Orleans Time-Picayune. And I think this is really the most important way to understand what happened and what didn't happen. After 5 days managing near riots, medical horrors, and unspeakable living conditions inside the Superdome, Louisiana National Guard Colonel Thomas Barron prepared to hand over the dead to representatives of the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Following days of internationally reported killings, rapes, and gang violence inside the dome, the doctor from FEMA, Barron doesn't remember his name, came prepared for a grisly scene. He brought a refrigerated 18-wheeler and 3 doctors to process bodies. Quote, I've got a report of 200 bodies in the dome, Barron recalls the doctor saying. The real total was 6, Barron said. Of those, 4 died of natural causes, 1 overdose, another jumped to his death in an apparent suicide, said Barron, who personally oversaw the turning over of bodies from a dome freezer, where they lay atop melting bags of ice. State health department officials in charge of body recovery put the official death count at the dome at 10, but Barron said that 4 other bodies were found in the street near the dome, not inside of it. Both sources said that none had been killed inside. At the Ernest N. Memorial Convention Center, named for, I believe, the first black mayor of New Orleans, just 4 bodies were recovered despite reports of corpses piled inside the building. Only one of the dead appeared to have been slain, and said health officials. That's the nation's first line emergency management believed the body count would resemble that of a bloody battle in a war, is but one of scores of examples of myths about the dome and the convention center, treated as fact by evacuees, the media, and even some of New Orleans' top officials, including the mayor and public superintendent. And here's the key line. As the fog of warlike conditions in Hurricane Katrina's aftermath has cleared, the vast majority of reported atrocities committed by evacuees have turned out to be false, or at least unsupported by evidence, according to key military, law enforcement, medical, and civilian officials in positions to know. Again, this article was published at the end of September, and you had a couple days where it was utter lawlessness within the city. And that's when all of these stories started to appear. And that's when, as the book, The Great New Orleans Gun Grab makes clear, Blackwater goes in, because they want to control and they want to make sure that a lot of these well-insured individuals who own a lot of the area around the port, who have vast goods that are going to be imported, exported, that things are okay. And they want to get a look, they've evacuated long before, Mr. Hood, the elite of the city, those who control capital. And they want to make sure that those who are left behind, that they tried to never interact with on a daily basis before Katrina, aren't going in and stealing and looting their property, or going into their homes as well. I mean, that was one of the big stories, is that you had all of these just immaculate homes that were abandoned by the people who fled Katrina when it was, again, you were told that this could hit the city. And if, I'm from the South, if there's ever a chance that a hurricane is going to hit the panhandle of the Gulf of America or any of that area, you're going to leave. You're going to be told you're going to leave, and you're going to get onto the highways. And you'll notice that if you're driving into Florida, a lot of the times they'll convert the highways so that you have highway evacuation, so that all the lanes leaving or coming to the city or that area of the country, these little hands come down so that, hey, this is for hurricane evacuation. All these lanes are going to be used in case of a emergency. And the point is, from this Pulitzer Prize winning article, they let slip at the very beginning, all these things were said to have happened, but they can't be corroborated. There's no evidence that it happened. But again, stories don't come out of a vacuum. Things were really not just dicey, but we saw the horror, the unspeakable horror, except for, those who warned, guys like Carlton Putnam, who wrote Race and Reason, what was going to happen if you had a majority black city governed by black elected officials with a entire black bureaucracy in public safety. And every illusion, every lie came crashing down, like I said, in Katrina.
I think that the foundation of everything that we've been doing in many ways is still downstream for Katrina, because one of the, how can I put this? One of the biggest illusions in the movement is this idea of the collapse, right? Everybody says there's going to be a collapse. We got to prepare for the collapse. We're not going to vote our way out of this. We don't need politics. We don't need any of these things. You don't need to vote for these cucks in the GOP. You don't need to vote at all. Just pile guns, get ready, arm up, get ready for the collapse. And you say, well, when is the collapse going to come? And of course, it never does. But it actually did in New Orleans. It collapsed overnight. It collapsed within a span of hours. And who enforced order in these neighboring communities? There were like bands of white Southerners with signs that said, you loot, we shoot. According to some reports, basically blazing away at anybody who crossed these bridges. And that's who kept the mobs away. It actually was something out of like a zombie film or something. Now, the unfortunate reality is that the reason I think they got away with it is because they didn't have the cameras to document everything. And all these guys would be getting sent to jail for like 1 billion years if they could do it now. Doesn't matter the fact that they saved their communities. It doesn't matter the fact that these criminals were coming to cause trouble and do nothing else. All of that's real. But because those things are real, that's why these innocent people would need to have been condemned. The other thing is that if we think of how Katrina was used by power, all the lessons that we take from it, they impose the opposite. They saw the breakdown of Black authority, and therefore the solution is we need to have more Black authority. They saw the complete inability of Black political machines to maintain basic infrastructure, and the lesson learned was we need to make sure whites don't have any control over these areas. I mean, this is, again, relevant to the debate that's happening now with crime. This is what it's so frustrating because we are trapped in a narrative where the facts really don't matter, because the facts of Katrina were known and promoted at the time. Jared Taylor's article was the best summary of that. And yet that was then taken as the reason to crack down more on white racism. And as you point out, that was the thing that was used to push Jared Taylor out of what little mainstream credibility he still had at the time, and Steve Saylor, who hasn't regained mainstream credibility until quite recently.
No, and I think that is one of the breaking things, because the reality of Katrina, and again, I'm reading this at this newspaper article, and it's so unspeakably dishonest, because it's written and it's disingenuous, and yet it was bestowed with the Pulitzer Prize because they came in and instead of reporting any facts or looking into anything, they just basically said, yeah, there was no evidence. We found no evidence, and we take for word what was found, and we're not going to look into it. Because even I forgot about this. In reading this essay, it writes Scott Thrickhild. No, I'm sorry, not Scott Thrickhild. Who wrote this? Doesn't even say who wrote it. There's this powerful line. Quote, in interviews with Oprah Winfrey, Black police chief Eddie Compass, I'm adding that, he is Black, Compass reported rapes of babies. Mayor Ray Nagin spoke of hundreds of armed guard members killing and raping people inside the dome. Unidentified evacuees told of children stepping over so many bodies we couldn't count. The picture that emerged was one of the impoverished masses of flood victims resorting to utter depravity, randomly attacking each other, as well as the police trying to protect them and the rescue workers trying to save them. Nagin told Winfrey the crowd had descended to an almost animalistic state. 4 weeks after the storm, few of the widely...
if we wrote this, we'd be racist.
Yeah, but this was going on. Like in the few days after the event, as I'm reading this, I'm remembering watching these clips of what was happening, because again, Oprah was crying. Oprah, because again, this is a city that is heavily Black, and Oprah is an intelligent person, and it's all the lies that have been told for decades that have been forced upon us. They're coming crashing down. They're being washed away with the floodwaters of Katrina. And here you have the mulatto mayor of very light-skinned mayor of New Orleans, who's saying it's an almost animalistic state. And then, exactly, people would be epileptic if we wrote stuff like this. 4 weeks after the storm, few of the widely reported atrocities have been backed with evidence. Piles of bodies never materialized, and soldiers, police officers, and rescue personnel on the front lines say that although anarchy reigned at times and people suffered unimaginable indignities, most of the worst crimes reported at the time never happened. Military, law enforcement, and medical workers agreed that the flood of evacuees, about 30,000 at the dome and an estimated 10 to 20,000 at the convention center overwhelmed their security personnel. Again, I've read Ray Nagin's book. They talk about how they found out through some reconnaissance and through some informants that were at the convention center that there was a planned coup that was about to happen because there was no food, there was no water for a number of days. There was no federal response, and that they were able to put it down and to have enough manpower to stop this from happening. Um, and again, in this article, it's basically public relations for maintaining the lies that, oh no, things weren't as bad as you think they were. Yeah, they were. They were. In fact, the article even points out it's almost like what's being written about Washington D.C. right now. The article at the very beginning talks about how there were only 4 confirmed murders in New Orleans in the aftermath of Katrina, making it a typical week in a city that anticipated more than 200 homicides this year. Um, the district attorney of Orleans Parish expressed outrage at reports from many national media outlets that suffering flood victims had turned into mobs of unchecked savages. Well, again, the city at the time of Katrina, Mr. Hood, was, a small footprint of its normal 450,000 people plus tourists. So if you have 4 murders in a span of, with what, couple, maybe 80,000 people in the city, yeah, there was lawlessness. If you're confirming that, I mean, that's like what we're seeing now, where in Washington, D.C., with the federal takeover of the city, I think they've gone 14 days now without a homicide, and they're making a big deal about that. But if you read a lot of the press, people living in Anacostia and some of the wards of DC that are heavily black, they're still talking about, hey, listen, we're afraid to go outside. They're shooting still. There's still violence. But again, the white people that matter don't go to those areas, so they don't really care. And in the case of New Orleans, I think it's a area, and Katrina is a time period where a lot of white people across the country, they're just glad that refugees from Katrina weren't inundated into their city, because we read in 2007, 2008 about spikes in crime, violent crime, homicides in places like Houston, Texas, where a lot of the black diaspora from New Orleans were resettled. And again, that completely remade the parts of Houston where you had so many people flood into the area, that kind of overwhelmed the resources in that particular part of Texas, which they're never going to return. And the idea was that New Orleans was going to become this majority white area, which of course that is the crux of the conspiracy behind the bombing of the levees, which is what which is the thesis of Spike Lee's documentary that you can watch on Netflix now. And unfortunately, that's shaping the narrative, when in fact the narrative is, we don't know what had to happen to regain order in New Orleans. And it wasn't General Henri showing up, 4 or 5 days after the fact. What happened in the 2 to 3 day time period where all these stories were necessitating the police chief going on international media, the mayor going on Oprah Winfrey talking about the animalistic nature of the Superdome, what actually took place. And that's where a publication like American Renaissance is necessary, because again, it's the 20th anniversary and people are talking about it, but no one's pointing out, well, this kind of stuff actually happened. Why aren't we talking about that and trying to look into some of these claims? Because pretty much, as you've said, I think eloquently, Katrina was the genesis of noticing. And for about a decade, it was very problematic for those of us who noticed. There were a lot of hall monitors and individuals who wanted to keep that conversation from happening. But because so many people, Mr. Hood, persevered and were able to withstand those arrows fired to try and stop the noticing, I think, like you said, Steve Saylor's never been more relevant now than he is right now in 2025 with his book, and more influential to a point where you've got the governor of California attacking all of the red states because of how, the homicide rate versus California. And at the very heart of that is a population group that we're not supposed to say anything negative about, but is responsible for all of those homicides and that great disparity between California and Mississippi, or California, Louisiana, or California, Missouri. It's that great unmentionable that we've all had to carry the water for and pretend that at some point, I swear it's going to work. At some point, it's going to work. And yet, when it mattered most, a city had the chance to prove that it could work, and in a monumental way, prove the racists were right.
Which is why they can never forgive it. Which is why everything happened the way it did. I mean, when you get, it's sort of like the O.J. Simpson trial. I mean, you get these things where if you actually think about the logical conclusions of what you're witnessing, the actions that you would need to take in consequence are so extreme and counter the fundamental premises of your society so completely that you can't cope with it. And so you have to make more excuses. You have to retreat into ideology even further. And that's really all we've been doing ever since. The only thing that's changed is we have social media in a way that we didn't before. And social media strengthened this kind of racial orthodoxy in the early years of Black Lives Matter, the second Obama administration. Some might even argue 2017 in some ways, despite the alt-right and everything else. But now it's gotten to a point where they can no longer maintain control of the narrative. And as proof of that, it's not just what's happened in the United States, but what's happening in Europe right now.
Oh, I mean, again, and I've read a couple articles that have been published in the international press that discuss from a perspective of this. There were a couple girls from Wales, and they talk about the horror of what they faced. And in the initial days of the rescue of these European white tourists from Europe and from England and from Australia, they talked about it being hell on earth in the Superdome, and that they faced racial antagonism. It never said, they were singled out for being white. It just it led you to understand that that's what it was. And that, and then again, a guy wrote a book. You have to wonder if this guy, Paul Harris, wrote Diary from the Dome thinking that he was going to get some sort of, sinecure position as a tenured professor somewhere for putting out this document, or maybe even writing this to be like, hey, this is going to be a great story someday to have as a Netflix special. But it's been largely forgotten about because, as you've said, those uncomfortable first few days exposed, for those who want to accept this isn't going to work out, this attempt to basically abandon the city of New Orleans. Again, you can go to amarin.com and you can look at the Great Replacement article Greg Hood wrote on New Orleans. This was a city that was 65% white. It was at one point, like so many of the cities Mr. Hood documented in that series, which hopefully will one day be turned into a book. But this was a crown jewel of America. It's a place that was the home of the Sugar Bowl back when the SEC was segregated, the Southeastern Conference. It was a place where you would attract the top SEC schools to have their game in January. It was a place for a lot of conventions for large companies, for large events, for large sectors to come together to relax. And of course, New Orleans is, to this day, it's still one of America's most violent cities. And I've only been once since Katrina, and it was eerie because I tried to get into the Superdome. There's no lingering impact really that it ever happened. Life goes on. But for those of us who notice, for those of us who remember what happened, we realize that what happened in Katrina could easily happen anywhere in the United States at this point. And what's even more interesting is that at that point, New Orleans was pretty much a white-black city. And a lot of the people who went in to get some of these ridiculously profitable contracts to clean up New Orleans were illegal aliens. I don't know if you remember this, but a lot of the people within New Orleans were upset.
This is where the initial thing about Ray Nagin and the Chocolate City, where he said that we are defending New Orleans as a chocolate city. And there were a bunch of people criticizing him about this. But of course, what had happened was, just as they proved completely incapable of maintaining infrastructure, just as they proved completely incapable of basic public safety duties, just as they proved completely incapable of just staying at their post in the midst of a disaster. And you remember after the fact, they all went on like vacation to Las Vegas, paid for
Oh
by the
my,
city. You
yes,
remember that?
yes, they
Yeah,
did.
that's right. And your tax dollars at work. They they also, I mean, what are you going to do? You're going to have blacks like rebuild the city? I mean, it's so ridiculous that obviously they just brought in a bunch of illegals to do it, and then that had led to a population change. And in many ways, the city population has changed. I know from people who live there and have been there quite a bit, they've said, it's never really been the same. It went from basically a white black city, like a typical southern city, to, a multicultural, multiracial mess the way it is now. But one of the interesting things that's happened is because black power was not just delegitimized and disproven, but also displaced demographically a little bit, the cultural symbols of blackness actually increased because it was after Katrina where you really saw the efforts to take down all the Confederate monuments, to really dunk on what's left of the white Southern identity, and
Mayor Landrieu.
how important it used to be to the Old South and to the Confederacy and to the America that was. And again, the reason to do these things is not because the white South was a disgraceful memory. It was because the black present is a disgraceful memory. And if we consider that honestly, we just can't go on as we are. Therefore, we have to delegitimize everything that happened 150 years ago and close our eyes and plug our ears to the butchery that continues today.
Yeah, and as we close out this conversation, so few people on what the right is really want to go back and think about New Orleans and think about all the stories. And the two big pieces to go back and read, and I've told Peter Brimlow this, giving Steve Saylor that voice to write the articles that he did, and the fact that National Review basically said, holy God, John Potter's, who, again, talk about a child of nepotism. The only reason we even know who he is because of his dad being one of the main architects of neoconservatism. But Steve Saylor wrote a very important article that stands the test of time, because he dared ask the question of, is this the way we should be going? Let the good times roll. And then Jared Taylor, when he wrote, again, Africa in Our Midst, which ends with those just absolutely incredibly profound lines that he once told me he somewhat regretted writing. But I said, sir, why? Like, you laid it out. And I'll read from it again because you quoted from it. But I think it's so important for people to understand that this is a fact. It's not contestable. There is no example otherwise to prove it wrong, whether it be Haiti, a country that, Mr. Hood, you and I have talked about. It's basically descended into chaos. There are gangs now who control Port-au-Prince and Blackwater, or I'm sorry, Eric Prince and XE are down there right now trying to regain control, because I believe that's an area where they want to start to prepare for the TPS, which ends in October of 2025. We've got about 750,000 Haitians in the U.S. who have to go back. And Mr. Taylor wrote these words: Africa in our midst, that utterly alien Africa of roadside corpses, cruelty, and anarchy. Blacks and whites are different. When blacks are left entirely to their own devices, Western civilization, any kind of civilization, disappears. And though there's been a massive attempt to retcon what happened during Katrina, all you have to do is go back and you can read the Pulitzer Prize winning article from the New Orleans Times-Picayune, and you can realize that there had to have been evidence to support Ray Nagin saying that there were animalistic conditions within the Superdome, that the black sheriff who was in control of a police force that was deteriorating by the minute before his eyes, people just abandoning their jobs. Again, he's claiming that there are bodies and there's gangs and there's violence happening, and send help, please, someone come in. And again, all the national press around the world was treated to reading stories about these white individuals who were rescued by the absolutely heroic Staff Sergeant Ogden, who I actually tried to get in touch with him back in 2014 when I was really researching New Orleans, and I couldn't find any way to get in touch with him because no one's ever bothered to follow up and ask him any questions about.
That's what's extraordinary about it.
I
Nobody,
mean, it's like
there's no reporting, there's no interest. The only kind of documentary, the only kind of reporting you're going to get is the same old thing about, did you know that the blacks were oppressed, or a conspiracy theory that, George Bush blew up the levees for some unknown reason.
we were in a position to potentially do a really big article in 2015 on the 10-year anniversary that could have gotten that probably would have been read by a lot of people and it would have been discussed and denounced. And I went out of my way to try and find a way to contact Ogden because there had been an article published in an Australian paper. I forgot the guy's name. His first name is Bud. He was the one who helped. He was sort of the ringleader of this international cohort, this coterie of Europeans and a few Americans. And as Paul Harris said, they were bestowed with white privilege to be evacuated before everyone else. And I was like, God, I really want to know what happened to this Ogden guy because he has a story to tell. And it's, as far as I can find on the internet, at that point, Google was not as difficult to utilize as it has become. I mean, it's basically impossible to search for stories. I would love to know what happened to him. And I would love to just talk and just say, hey, why did you decide to pull as many strings as you could to get these people out, 3 days after chaos began, and they were left there for 2 days fending for themselves. And you can read the story in Steve Sailer or Jared Taylor's essay about how the white males in their group, they formed a protective perimeter around the group, and they took turns sleeping because they were being harassed and there was no security. And it's like, what happened? And again, from all I can tell, from all I can read, there weren't that many white people at the convention center, which is where most of the violence was said to have taken place and where the bulk of the bodies were supposedly happening to be found. Again, I think before we started this podcast, we both talked about how initially there were stories of refrigeration units that were, for lack of a better term, regrettably brimming with dead bodies that were there for health reasons. And it's like, well, what happened? I mean, when you've got a guy like Chris Kyle, who, let's face it, that's pretty much, it's basically him and Marcus Luttrell, I guess, or Pat Tillman, that we talk about from the global war on terror. I think those are the three biggest names. I think Marcus Luttrell was the guy that they made the movie Lone Survivor with Mark Wahlberg, and then Chris Kyle, yep. American Sniper. And then no one wants to talk about Pat Tillman because Pat Tillman realized correctly that it was all BS. And he was basically planning to come back and tell the entire country that, hey, I made a mistake and we're doing this for all the wrong reasons. And he would have been a hero and probably have derailed a lot for George W. Bush in the 2004 election. But Chris Kyle claims he was deployed to Katrina almost immediately and that he killed 30 people or more, regaining control of the city. And you can go online and you can find a lot of people who've made similar claims on chats. They said, yeah, I was Blackwater. We were sent there. We were given orders of what we could do, and we did it to regain control of the city. Because, again, as that New Orleans Time-Picayune article makes clear, the black police chief and black mayor of the city were going on television, ranting and raving about the failures of their leadership and the animalistic nature of life that immediately spawned once any trappings of Western civilization disappeared. And it's an extraordinary lesson that too few people within power at this point have allowed to absorb. I have a feeling that a lot of people within the Trump administration, Mr. Hood, have probably read Jared Taylor's essay, Africa in Our Midst. And it's a great disservice that more people aren't talking about Katrina at the 20th anniversary from this perspective. But it is a good thing that a lot of people are no longer harping about HARP and about weather modification. But to close it out, it is interesting that the narrative that is being pushed now on Netflix, the only documentary on Katrina, it is 100% postulating that the federal government blew up the levees on purpose to hurt the black community and the black inhabitants of the lower Ninth Ward. I'll let you close it out.
No, I think that what Katrina ultimately shows is that reality, even reality when it is shown on the broadest possible scale to the most possible people, when the truth is known, when the truth is in pictures, when the truth is on video, when the truth is widely reported, maybe not reported by everybody, but it is widely reported, it still doesn't matter. People still fundamentally interpret facts through a narrative framework that gives them a moral meaning. And we saw the way the liberal establishment doubled down on the myths of egalitarianism, even after the most spectacular failure imaginable in New Orleans. And we saw even how, insofar as he was a figure of the American right, which I guess was debatable, but the center right president of the time, I mean, his administration was deeply damaged by this, even though there's almost no capable emergency response you could do in any of these situations unless you just literally declare martial law from the federal government down and just ignore all blacks and put guns in their backs and march them around, which is actually for their own good. Now we're at the point where a lot of mainstream people on the American right, including to some extent the president of the United States, is talking like this. And that does represent progress, but we shouldn't kid ourselves that there's ever a point where any event, even the most spectacular event, even the most disastrous event, is actually going to change anybody's minds. People are wedded to their morality and they are not going to shake it except in the most extreme circumstances, something akin to a religious conversion.
And again, a lot of the people, the cognitive dissonance that will transpire is going to cause them extreme discomfort to realize that a religion that they held aloft as their god, egalitarianism, when that comes crashing down, it's very difficult to accept that everything that I've been promoting in my life, everything that I accepted as reality, it was wrong. In a lot of ways, that's what a lot of people who push the COVID narrative at first are still incapable of understanding. I mean, we've seen so many people, Mr. Hood, from the CDC recently abandon their roles and resign. And one of the people is this weird Greek guy who is this legitimate Satanist sadist who wears, bondage outfits underneath his suit. And this was one of the people who was responsible for the CDC response to COVID. And you're looking around, you're like, who's in charge? What have we allowed to happen to the country? And yet, again, during Katrina, the people who were in charge were admitting their incompetence and their failure, and they were begging for a federal response. So again, we sent in all that we could. And then again, we brushed aside all the stories that, again, they had to have had a legitimate source to create that urgency of come help us, please help us. It's animalistic here. And now I think some of the smart liberals all in with this. Mayor Brandon Johnson of Chicago. This is a city that you and I've talked about a lot. In fact, you helped edit a book about Chicago, The Second City Confidential, and which just documents what life has been like as Chicago went from being 95% white in 1920 to about 33% white today. And threats of the Trump administration basically coming in to clean up the city and combat crime. The black mayor, Mayor Johnson, said that that's racist, immoral, and unholy. So I guess it's moral and holy to live in an area of the country.
It is holy. I mean, it's a religious thing. I mean, when people talk about racial egalitarianism, it's a religious assertion. There's no evidence to suggest it. And when you actually press people on it, you get even people who don't believe in God, certainly
No.
don't believe in the God of the Bible or take any of it seriously. But suddenly they start saying, "Oh, well, we're all created in God's image," and all the rest of it. It's like, what are you basing that on? And if, frankly, I mean, after what you saw in New Orleans, I mean, if we're all based on God's image, that doesn't say very much about the Imago Dei, does it?
Well, with that, Mr. Hood, I think we can wrap up what has been a very spirited conversation about Hurricane Katrina turning 20. And it is a conversation that we need to see more of. We need to see more people look into it because there are still opportunities to investigate what happened, because the left did that. The left spent 3 years after Katrina researching. ProPublica did a lot of investigation into the Algiers community to try and write about the purported race war that happened. Um, and that was all that was something that they kept talking about up until probably 2013, 2014, as one of those early moments where, like you said, and I think that was a brilliant observation, that this all predated Black Lives Matter, but in a lot of ways it paved the way, and it was sort of the building blocks that were, hey, the federal government blew up the levees. The federal government abandoned blacks to be in control of their own lives within the city, and then they begged for help because we're all the white people. Why is Bush not helping us? And that basically said, I guess our lives don't matter. And I think that's a very brilliant observation that deserves a far greater analysis, especially because of all the academic papers that have been written from a very Black-centric lens about Katrina. And just, if anybody out there is listening who has a way to tell us some stories, if by chance individuals who were potentially, XE Blackwater, I'd love to just, again, it all off the record. It's just stuff that it's a very important time period that needs to be discussed more. And more importantly, if anybody out there listening, if you guys know if Staff Sergeant Ogden is still alive, he's a hero. I would love to have the opportunity to talk to him. I think Jared Taylor would love to talk to him. And it's just to get the story out because, again, the left will always do what they can to censor and to obfuscate facts to conform to the narrative that has to be maintained. And you can get in touch with me by sending an email to becausewelivehere@protonmail.com. Once again, that email is becausewelivehere@protonmail.com. And you can get in touch with Greg Hood by
Hood at nc-f.org. Just check the American Renaissance website. Contact us. That's the best way to do it.
Well, for Greg Hood, this has been Paul Kersey, and we look forward to talking to you next week with another edition of View from the Right. Our time is up. We thank you for yours.